picture this. You are having just the absolute perfect summer day.
Right, like totally ideal weather.
Exactly. The sun is shining, there's this really gentle breeze, and you are just lounging in a hammock in your backyard.
Sounds pretty amazing, honestly.
Right. It is great. And you reach over to the small table next to you for some light beach reading, like maybe a thriller you picked up at the airport.
Or one of those breezy romance novels.
Yeah, exactly. Just something easy. But instead, someone hands you this heavy, incredibly dense cocktail of like 19th century existential philosophy, surrealist classic literature, and just really radical bare-knuckle political activism from the 1970s.
Wow. Yeah, that is a bit of a mood killer.
It really is. It was not exactly what you expect when you are just trying to close your eyes and unwind, you know?
No, not at all.
But honestly, that jarring contrast between the setting and the substance is exactly what makes today's deep dive into our source materials so endlessly fascinating.
It really is a striking juxtaposition. The source material we are looking at today comes from this Dutch cultural broadcast.
Right, from a channel called Ongeheard Nederland, I think?
Yes, exactly. And the hosts of this show literally framed their own program to their audience as, quote, high culture in your hammock.
Which is such a funny phrase, high culture in your hammock.
It really is. I mean, they are taking these incredibly weighty historical thinkers, right? People who literally dedicated their lives to writing about existential dread and suffocating bureaucracy and, the ruthless mechanics of power.
Yeah, heavy, heavy stuff.
Super heavy.
Yeah.
And they are using them to decode very modern anxieties.
Right.
But they are doing it with this breezy, almost summer vacation tone that just makes the conceptual medicine go down in a highly unique way.
It is so unique, but before we dig into the architecture of their arguments, we really need to draw a very firm line in the sand for you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely. This is so important.
Because the material we are pulling from today, it is not some dry, dusty academic lecture from a university basement.
No, far from it.
It is a highly charged, system-critical, and distinctly right-leaning political broadcast.
Very much so.
The commentators in this program are taking direct aim at, recent COVID-19 policies, massive government bureaucracies, and the cultural shifts they categorize as woke identity politics.
Right. They have very specific targets.
Yeah. And they are using these classic philosophical texts as, like, the bricks and mortar to build their arguments against these things.
Which brings us to the crucial impartiality clause for our discussion today.
Yes, please lay it out.
We are not endorsing these political views.
No, we are not.
We are not taking sides on these cultural battlegrounds, whether it involves the left or the right. Our job today is entirely analytical.
Exactly. We are just looking at the mechanics of it.
Right. We are acting as your impartial guides through a very complex intellectual architecture. What is fascinating here is not whether you agree or disagree with their politics.
Because you can definitely make up your own mind on that.
Exactly. The fascinating part is how they are utilizing figures like Søren Kierkegaard, Franz Kafka, and Saul Alinsky to construct this highly specific worldview.
Right. It is the how, not the what.
Yes, we are analyzing the rhetoric, the logic, and just the historical synthesis they're deploying.
I love that. Think of us as museum curators walking you through a really controversial, highly modern art exhibit.
That is a great way to put it.
We're here to point out the brushstrokes, the lighting, and the historical references the artist is using without, necessarily buying the painting to hang in our own living room.
Perfect analogy.
So let us jump straight into the first element of this hammock cocktail, because the Dutch broadcasters begin their analysis by tackling arguably the most pervasive emotion in modern society right now.
Right. Paralyzing fear.
Exactly, fear.
Yeah.
And to find an antidote, it is so interesting. They do not look forward to modern psychology. They look backward.
Way backward. To the 1840s, actually.
Yeah, to the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard.
Specifically, they zero in on Kierkegaard's seminal work, Fear and Trembling.
Oh, man, that is a heavy read.
It really is. And they focus on his central concept of the leap of faith. Now, the context here is super vital.
Right, set the stage for us.
The broadcasters are looking at the state of Europe and really the whole Western world over the last few years.
Yeah.
They are reflecting on the societal paralysis during the COVID-19 lockdowns, the looming anxiety over energy shortages, and just massive economic inflation.
Basically all the things keeping people up at night.
Exactly. And they argue that society has been entirely gripped by a sort of existential rigor mortis.
Existential rigor mortis. Wow, that is quite an image.
It is, right? They say people effectively put their lives in the freezer.
Mm-hmm.
They stopped making decisions, they stopped taking risks, and they just sat there waiting for the government or for science or for some nameless authority figure to declare that it was safe to live again.
So they describe this modern mindset as this belief that life is basically a math equation, right?
Yeah, that is exactly how they frame it.
Like, it can be perfectly solved if we just wait for all the right variables to line up perfectly.
Which, of course, they never do.
Right. But the program argues that Kierkegaard absolutely shatters that illusion.
Totally shadows it.
And to explain this, they use Kierkegaard's analysis of the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac.
Yes, and this is such a wild story to use.
It really is. And I want to emphasize, even if you, the listener, are completely secular, the psychological framework Kierkegaard extracts from this ancient story is just wild.
It really is mind-blowing.
So God tells Abraham to take his beloved son, Isaac, and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah.
Right. And remember, this is the son he waited a century for.
Literally 100 years.
Yeah, the one who was promised to be the father of nations.
It is the ultimate, completely absurd test. It makes absolutely no logical sense.
None. And Kierkegaard uses this extreme scenario to differentiate between two archetypes of human behavior.
Okay, what is the first one?
The first is what he calls the night of infinite resignation.
The night of infinite resignation.
Yeah. And to illustrate this, the Dutch broadcast actually brings up a different mythological figure, the Greek king Agamemnon.
Oh, right, from the Trojan War.
Exactly. Agamemnon is told by the gods that he must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, so that the winds will blow and his massive fleet can sail to Troy.
Right, because his ships are totally stuck.
Right. So Agamemnon does it.
Hmm.
But he does it out of this grim, soul-crushing sense of duty to the state and his army.
He is basically forced into it.
Exactly. He resigns himself to the tragedy, he gives up everything he loves, and his life essentially becomes just a hollow monument to that unavoidable suffering.
Okay, let me just jump in here with a modern analogy, because this distinction is really the bedrock of their entire argument.
Yeah, go for it.
The night of infinite resignation is kind of like an elite Olympic athlete who sacrifices their entire youth, their social life, and their physical comfort for, like, the slim chance of a gold medal.
Right, they give up everything.
Yeah, they suffer through grueling pain every single day, completely miserable, viewing the present moment only as a terrible price they just have to pay for a future outcome.
Mm-hmm.
They completely resign themselves to the misery of the process.
That captures the emotional state perfectly. You just check out of the present entirely.
Right.
But then Kierkegaard introduces the ultimate ideal, which is the night of faith.
And this is Abraham.
Exactly. This is how he categorizes Abraham. Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain, fully prepared to make the ultimate horrifying sacrifice.
Right.
But, and this is the philosophical twist that is so hard to grasp, he does it joyfully.
Joyfully. That is so counterintuitive.
It is. He does not complain. He does not drag his feet in this grim resignation like Agamemnon. He makes the leap of faith, trusting completely that somehow, impossibly, by virtue of the absurd, he will not actually lose Isaac. He accepts the terrifying reality of the physical world. He sees the knife, but he maintains this absolute faith in a higher outcome. And because of that impossible trust, he does not lose his capacity for joy in the present moment.
But wait, let me push back on that a little bit, because I can hear the listener thinking exactly what I'm thinking right now.
Oh, for sure. It is a hard concept.
An Olympic athlete has a tangible goal. They have statistics, coaches, a clear path to follow. Abraham had literally no proof he was getting Isaac back. In fact, all the physical evidence pointed to the exact opposite.
Right. He was literally holding the knife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So isn't this Dutch broadcast essentially asking their audience to adopt a state of total delusion? Like, if society is crumbling around you, pretending everything is fine, just seems like toxic positivity wrapped in a philosophical bow.
That is exactly the tension Kierkegaard is playing with. And it is a brilliant pushback. But the broadcasters aren't arguing for delusion, actually.
Okay, then what are they arguing for?
They are arguing against the paralysis of demanding certainty. Kierkegaard's point is that the demand for absolute certainty, the need for the math equation of life to perfectly balance before you take a single step, that is what actually kills you.
Ah, I see.
The knight of faith is not delusional about the danger. He is fully aware of the knife. But he refuses to let the anticipation of the tragedy destroy the beauty of the present.
So it is about not dying 1,000 deaths before the actual death.
Yes, exactly. The program applies this directly to modern citizens. They say if you just sit around waiting for the government to guarantee your safety or for the economy to perfectly stabilize, you will spend your entire life in the freezer.
You just miss your own life.
Right. You have to reclaim your agency and take the leap into the unknown, finding joy despite the void.
They connect this directly to what they call the makeability mindset of modern society, right?
Yes, this pervasive, almost therapeutic idea we have today that society is perfectly malleable.
Like if we just enact the right policies or install the perfect safety nets and engineer the right cultural norms, we can eradicate all risk, all suffering, all tragedy entirely.
Which is impossible.
Right. But the program argues this desire to control everything actually leads to our own destruction because it breeds a citizenry that is terrified of a breeze.
It creates total fragility.
Yeah.
And to drive this emotional point home, the hosts pivot from a 19th century text to this stunning piece of 20th century cinema.
I love this transition.
It is so good. They bring up the iconic Swedish director Ingmar Bergman and his 1957 masterpiece, The Seventh Seal.
Now, you have almost certainly seen this imagery parodied in pop culture, even if you haven't seen the movie. It's the classic visual of a medieval knight playing a game of chess with the literal Grim Reaper on this desolate beach.
Yes, Death with the Black Cloak.
Right, and it's so easy to just view that as a cool, spooky aesthetic, but the psychological state of that knight is exactly what the broadcasters are targeting.
Tell us about the knight's headspace.
Well, this knight has just returned from the Crusades. He has spent a decade fighting, marching, and killing for this grand, overarching religious cause.
A huge systemic mission.
Exactly. And what did it get him? He returns to a homeland entirely ravaged by the bubonic plague. He is surrounded by death, and his grand religious crusade suddenly feels completely meaningless.
He is suffering from the ultimate existential exhaustion.
Yes, just total burnout on a spiritual level. And when death finally comes for him on the beach, the knight challenges him to a game of chess.
Right. To buy time.
Exactly. He is desperate to perform just one truly meaningful act, to somehow solve the riddle of existence before his time runs out. He's looking for a grand revelation.
But the brilliance of the film, and the reason the Dutch commentators highlight it so heavily, is where the knight actually finds his meaning.
Yeah, it is not what you expect at all.
It is not a sweeping victory or some massive philosophical breakthrough.
No, it happens in this incredibly quiet, microscopic moment. The broadcast actually plays a clip where the knight sits down with a young, traveling circus family.
And they are completely powerless in this society.
Totally. They have no money, no social standing, and they are wandering through a plague-infested country. But they are joyful.
Oh, yeah, the Knights of Faith?
Exactly. They offer the exhausted knight a wooden bowl of fresh milk and some wild strawberries they just picked. And as he sits there in the grass, just tasting the strawberries, he has this massive epiphany.
The meaning of life.
Yes, this exact, fleeting, simple moment of human connection and sensory pleasure, that is the meaning of life.
The Grain Crusades were just a distraction.
Right. The philosophical dread was a trap. The meaning is literally just the strawberries and the milk.
The broadcasters synthesize Kierkegaard and Bergman beautifully here. They use that cinematic moment to really ground the philosophical theory.
That makes it so tangible.
It really does. They are telling their audience, look at the world right now. Yes, there are metaphorical plagues everywhere. There are political crises, energy shortages, cultural wars.
They can feel overwhelming.
Totally. But if you wait for all of those crusades to be resolved, you are already dead. You have to embody the Knight of Faith. You must intentionally seek out and protect your own strawberries and milk. You have to maintain your localized joy and your personal agency, regardless of what the macro system is doing.
It is a genuinely empowering message, on an individual level. The mandate to find your joy despite the chaos is universally appealing.
Definitely.
But I'm really struggling to reconcile this highly individualized philosophy with the reality of living in a deeply interconnected, heavily governed modern state.
Right, because we don't live in a vacuum.
Exactly. It is one thing to decide to just eat strawberries in a field. It is another thing entirely if the field is zoned by a massive bureaucracy that suddenly declares strawberries illegal and sends a clerk to fine you for drinking unpasteurized milk.
Yeah, that ruins the moment pretty quickly.
How do you take agency when the very structure of the society around you assumes you are inherently non-compliant or worse, guilty before you even act?
That exact tension is where the Dutch broadcast pivots to their next cultural artifact.
Ah.
Because they recognize that individual courage is very often crushed by systemic architecture. And to explore that crushing weight, they move from Kierkegaard's antidote for fear directly into the suffocating labyrinth of Franz Kafka.
Franz Kafka, the man whose very name became an adjective for bureaucratic nightmares. Kafkaesque.
Exactly. The source actually begins this segment with a really fascinating biographical parallel between Kierkegaard and Kafka.
Oh, really? How so?
They note how both men essentially amputated normal human experiences from their lives in service of their art. They both broke off engagements, they isolated themselves, and they just dove headfirst into their own psychological dread.
So they were both deeply familiar with that internal prison.
Yes. The broadcasters point out that both men were uniquely attuned to the invisible forces that dictate human behavior. And to set the stage for this, they briefly touch on Kafka's most famous novella, The Metamorphosis.
Oh, the bug story.
Right. You know the premise. Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to discover he's been transformed into a giant, horrific insect.
Which is terrifying.
Right. But the broadcasters don't actually care about the bug part. They care about Gregor's psychological reaction to being a bug.
Right, because his reaction is completely unhinged.
Yes. His first thought isn't sheer terror at his monstrous new form. His first thought is sheer panic that his alarm didn't go off, and he's going to miss his train to work, and his boss is going to be furious.
It's darkly hilarious, honestly, but it's profoundly disturbing.
It really is.
It captures this bizarre, immediate acceptance of a horrific personal fate, completely overshadowed by this deeply ingrained, crushing sense of guilt toward the economic system.
He is more terrified of disappointing middle management than he is of losing his own humanity.
Exactly. But the broadcasters only use the metamorphosis as sort of an appetizer, right?
Where they really anchor their political argument is in Kafka's unfinished masterpiece, The Trial, or Der Prozess in German.
Okay, let's get into The Trial.
The Trial is the ultimate blueprint for systemic dread. For those who haven't read it, the plot is deceptively simple, but philosophically just bottomless.
Walk us through it.
So the protagonist, a bank clerk named Joseph K., wakes up in his boarding house on his 30th birthday. Two unidentified men in suits walk into his room and inform him that he is under arrest.
Just out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. But they absolutely refuse to tell him what he's charged with.
And the opening line of that book is legendary. It translates roughly to, someone must have slandered Joseph K. because without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning.
That sentence is the linchpin of everything we're about to discuss.
It really is. The omniscient narrator explicitly establishes right on page 1 that Joseph K. is innocent. We, the audience, know he's entirely innocent.
Right. There is no ambiguity for the reader.
Yet from that exact moment forward, he is treated by this shadowy court system, by his peers, and tragically, eventually by himself, as eternally, fundamentally guilty.
And this leads to the core psychological puzzle of the novel, which the Dutch commentators dissect at length. Joseph K. is never actually placed in handcuffs or thrown in a cell.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The strange agents tell him he is, quote-unquote, arrested, but that he is completely free to go to work at the bank and continue his daily life while his case is processed.
Right. And that is the question that screams in the mind of every reader. If you know for an absolute objective fact that you are innocent and the door is physically open, why doesn't Joseph K. just run?
Why doesn't he flee the city?
Yeah. Why does he stay, hire a lawyer, and try to navigate this ridiculous, opaque court system that refuses to even tell him what the laws are?
Because Kafka understood, and the commentators are really highlighting this, the terrifying psychology of false guilt.
How does that work?
The broadcasters explain that when innocent people, especially well-socialized, law-abiding citizens, are suddenly accused by an overwhelming authority figure, their immediate instinct is not rebellion, it is cooperation.
Oh, that makes sense. You just want to clear things up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Joseph K. thinks, I am a rational man. This court must be made of rational men. This is clearly just an administrative error.
Right. A paperwork glitch.
Yeah. He thinks if I just show up, if I am polite, if I calmly explain my innocence, they will realize they made a mistake and apologize.
It's the instinct to appease the predator by showing your belly.
Completely.
He tries to shrink himself to fit their bureaucratic mold. But the horrific genius of the Kafkaesque trap is that every single word he speaks in his own defense, every logical argument he mounts, merely validates the authority of the fake court.
That is the trap.
By participating in the trial, he legitimizes the premise that he is on trial in the first place.
Precisely. And the program draws a chilling historical parallel here, stepping out of literature and into brutal 20th century history.
Where do they go with it?
They compare Joseph K.'s psychological trap directly to the tactics used during Joseph Stalin's show trials in the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. During the Great Purge, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, would arrest loyal party members and citizens completely arbitrarily.
And they wouldn't tell them why.
Exactly. They wouldn't read them a list of charges. Instead, the primary method of psychological torture during the interrogation was to sit the prisoner under a bright light and ask them, quote, "What do you think you did wrong?"
That is deeply, deeply sinister.
Psychological warfare.
By withholding the charge, the state forces the innocent person to become their own prosecutor.
Yes.
Like, if you are locked in a room and told you are guilty, you start frantically searching your own memories for infractions.
You start doubting your own reality.
Yeah. You think, did I look at a portrait of Stalin the wrong way? Did I complain about the bread lines to my neighbor? Was I late to the factory? You start confessing to your own private thoughts and minor, completely imaginary crimes, just desperately hoping to hit on the one specific thing that will satisfy the interrogator and end the suspense.
And the tragedy is that nothing ever satisfies them, because the process itself is the point.
The process is the punishment.
Exactly. In the trial, Joseph K. eventually has to go to court. But he doesn't go to a grand courthouse with marble pillars and, a dignified atmosphere.
Right. It is not a normal court.
Not at all. The court is hidden in the dusty, suffocating attics of massive, dilapidated apartment buildings.
That sounds awful.
It is. The bureaucracy, the judges, the corrupt clerks, and the squalid daily lives of the city's poorest citizens are all just mashed together in this oppressive, labyrinthine environment.
The broadcasters point out that in Kafka's world, the trial doesn't lead to a punishment. The process of the trial is the punishment.
It just wears you down.
The endless waiting in hallways, the incomprehensible legal documents, the constant low-level surveillance, it systematically grinds Joseph K. down until his spirit breaks and he actually internalizes the guilt the state projected onto him.
It is a total psychological collapse.
But here's where the Dutch hosts make their leap to modern political commentary. They bring in the philosopher Hannah Arendt to explain how this exact mechanism operates in modern democracies.
Right. Hannah Arendt, who extensively studied totalitarianism, she coined this concept of tyranny without a tyrant.
Tyranny without a tyrant. Okay, explain that.
The commentators use her work to make a very vital clarification for their listeners. They want their audience to understand that they're not claiming there is a literal smoky back room filled with comic book villains rubbing their hands together, actively plotting to destroy the average citizen.
Right, no cartoon villains required.
Exactly. A Kafkaesque nightmare doesn't require evil masterminds. It just requires compliance.
Just people following rules.
Yes. Arndt's point, which the broadcasters apply to modern Western governments, is that the machine is entirely self-sustaining. It is an ecosystem of fragmented responsibility.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, think about it. The police officer making the bizarre arrest, the clerk mindlessly stamping the paperwork, the judge upholding a microscopic subclause of a rule, the public health official writing an incredibly specific mandate. None of them view themselves as oppressive.
No, they are all, quote-unquote, just doing their job.
Exactly. But the collective, aggregated result of thousands of people blindly following the process without ever questioning the moral outcome is a massive, crushing weight that completely pulverizes the individual.
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Right. The bureaucracy develops an artificial intelligence of its own, prioritizing its own expansion and the mitigation of unrest over the delivery of actual human justice.
To illustrate this absurdity, the program points to a real-world, deeply ironic situation regarding environmental policy in the Netherlands.
Oh, this part is wild.
It is so bizarre. They bring up the garbage situation in Amsterdam.
Right.
So Amsterdam is a city that prides itself heavily on being a global beacon of green, progressive, environmentally conscious policy. Right?
Yes, they are very proud of that.
The local government highly regulates the carbon footprint of its citizens. But currently, Amsterdam is importing hundreds of massive truckloads of actual raw garbage from Rome, Italy, and burning it in Amsterdam's local incinerators.
Wait, what? Why would they do that?
The logic behind this is purely Kafkaesque. The mayor of Rome was apparently concerned that burning Rome's poorly sorted trash in their own aging facilities would cause a localized dioxin pollution problem for Italian citizens.
Okay.
So, through this massive web of international bureaucratic agreements, Amsterdam takes the trash, drives it across Europe, emitting massive amounts of diesel exhaust, burns it in their own city, and pollutes their own air.
That makes absolutely no sense.
It doesn't. And they do this all while the municipal government is simultaneously punishing a local Dutch citizen for, like, driving an older, non-electric car.
Wow. That is the literal definition of Kafkaesque.
As the broadcast frames it, it is the literal definition of chopping down the forest to save the trees.
Right.
It's a bureaucracy creating this absurd, contradictory reality that the individual citizen has no power to change but is forced to live within and pay taxes toward.
It is just maddening.
But as fascinating as their critique of government bureaucracy is, the Dutch hosts do not stop there.
No, they take it a step further.
They don't just view Kafka as a lens for state power. They argue that this exact same psychological trap, the assumption of inescapable guilt, has fundamentally infected how citizens judge each other in the cultural sphere.
Which brings us to a significant pivot in their analysis. And listener, this is where we navigate into highly sensitive, intensely debated socio-political waters.
Yes, very sensitive.
The broadcasters take Kafka's theory of inescapable guilt and the tyranny without a tyrant and apply it directly to modern identity politics.
Right.
Specifically targeting the academic and cultural framework surrounding white guilt and what is colloquially known as woke culture.
And again, we really have to pause and impartially unpack their rhetorical strategy here. We're analyzing how they build their argument, not endorsing it.
Absolutely. We are just looking at the blueprints.
The structural argument the program makes is that the modern concept of white guilt, as framed by certain cultural activists, functions structurally identically to the shadowy court in the trial.
How do they draw that parallel?
They argue it is an inescapable, perpetual guilt that is assigned to an individual, not because of any specific malicious action they personally committed, but strictly because of their inherent demographic status.
So it is guilt by association.
Yes, you are deemed guilty by default, simply by virtue of the historical system you were born into.
And to ground this theoretical claim, the broadcasters spend significant time dissecting a specific piece of media.
Right, they look at an interview.
Yes, an interview published in a major Dutch newspaper, De Volkskrant. It features a prominent French-Algerian activist named Huria Boutelja.
Okay, who is she?
Boutelja is a known figure in post-colonial activism, and the Dutch hosts meticulously deconstruct her rhetorical framework in this interview. They argue that she has constructed a literal Kafkaesque trap, an impossible paradoxical standard for the white Westerner.
So according to the commentator's analysis of the interview, Boutelja's framework creates a scenario where no matter what a person of a white Western background says or does, they cannot achieve moral absolution.
Right, the trap has two jaws.
The first jaw is pretty obvious, right? If you argue against the activist, if you deny the premise of your inherent guilt, you are displaying fragility and actively proving your systemic racism.
Yes, denial is proof of guilt. But the second jaw is where the real Kafkaesque twist lies.
This is the tricky part.
The broadcasters point out that within this framework, if you actually agree with the activist, if you enthusiastically claim to be an ally, if you apologize for your ancestry, or if you point to your good intentions and your anti-racist actions, this is not accepted as exoneration.
No, it is not.
Instead, it is immediately dismissed as a manifestation of a, quote, white good conscience.
Let's pause there because the mechanics of that specific phrase, white good conscience, are what the Dutch hosts find so insidious.
It's a very loaded phrase.
I want to try an analogy to explain how they view this dynamic.
Sure, go ahead.
Imagine you were forced to play a rigged carnival game. You know the ones where the guy on the microphone is taunting you and the basketball hoop is actually a quarter-inch smaller than the ball?
Right. You can never win.
Exactly. But in this specific game, the rules of physics change depending on who is throwing the dart. You are accused by the crowd of an overarching systemic guilt. You step up to the booth and you try to prove you are a good person. You say, look, I treat everyone equally in my daily life. I marched for your rights. I donated to your cause. I am on your side.
And in a traditional moral framework, those actions would absolutely prove your innocence.
Exactly. But in this Kafkaesque game, the person running the booth looks at you and says, but the very fact that you think you have the power to help me, the very fact that you feel satisfied with your own moral goodness and your charity is proof of your underlying subconscious arrogance.
Wow.
Your good conscience is just a privileged luxury that proves your complicity in the hierarchy.
That analogy captures their critique perfectly. The more you struggle to prove your innocence, the more you inherently implicate yourself in the eyes of the court.
It is maddening.
The broadcasters actually term this a low-energy guilt trap.
A low-energy guilt trap. What does that mean?
It means it is highly efficient for the accuser, but it is utterly exhausting for the accused. They argue it is purposefully designed to keep a specific demographic constantly on the defensive.
Always backpedaling.
Right. These citizens are forced to continuously apologize, continuously read new literature to educate themselves, and continuously prove their innocence. But they are running a marathon that intentionally has no finish line.
Because if they reach the finish line, the power dynamic ends.
Exactly. The program argues that in this framework, guilt is no longer tied to action. It is treated as an original sin attached to one's background and culture. It cannot be washed off, only managed through perpetual submission.
And the broadcast does not view this dynamic as, just a random cultural accident or just a few radical activists being loud on social media.
No, they see it as highly orchestrated.
They trace the intellectual lineage of the strategy directly back to the Frankfurt School.
Yes. And for context, the Frankfurt School was a group of 20th century Marxist and neo-Marxist philosophers and sociologists associated with the Institute for Social Research in Germany.
Right.
They were the pioneers of critical theory, which is the practice of relentlessly critiquing and analyzing society and culture to uncover hidden power dynamics.
And the Dutch commentators frame this modern application of critical theory as a brilliant, highly calculated, and deeply corrosive strategy.
The program argues that the strategy of the Frankfurt School, as adopted by modern activists, is designed to slowly, methodically wear down the psychological defenses of the dominant societal norms.
Just constant pressure.
Exactly. If you can keep the dominant culture perpetually off balance, constantly questioning its own morality, constantly apologizing for its history, they eventually become exactly like Joseph K.
They just break down.
They become exhausted, compliant, and fundamentally unable to mount a defense for their own cultural values.
To give a localized example of how this plays out, the hosts point to events at places like De Roodhoed.
Oh, De Roodhoed, yes.
This is a very famous historic, cultural, and debate center in Amsterdam, originally a clandestine church, actually.
A beautiful building.
And the broadcasters refer to certain modern events held there as struggle sessions, borrowing a term from Maoist China.
That is a very intense comparison.
It is. They claim that affluent, well-meaning Dutch citizens voluntarily buy tickets to sit in these beautiful halls and essentially be told by panels of activists how terribly guilty, privileged, and historically toxic they are, over and over again.
And people pay for this.
Yes. The hosts view this not as education, but as this bizarre modern ritual of Kafkaesque self-flagellation.
So if we pull all the threads together up to this point, the picture the Dutch broadcast has painted of the modern Western citizen is profoundly bleak.
It is incredibly grim.
They see a populace paralyzed by the existential fear Kierkegaard described. They see an individual crushed by the incomprehensible self-sustaining bureaucracy Kafka outlined. And they see a culture ensnared in an inescapable psychological guilt trap engineered by modern identity politics.
Right. It's this triple threat of dread. And if you are listening to this broadcast in your hammock, you might be thinking, well, the game is rigged.
Totally right.
The state has the power, the culture has the moral high ground, and I am basically trapped in the matrix. What is the point of even trying?
Do they just tell everyone to give up?
Do the broadcasters just advocate for giving up and, hiding in the woods with your strawberries and milk?
No, they absolutely do not.
Okay, good.
And this is where the ideological architecture of the broadcast takes its most fascinating paradoxical turn.
Oh, I cannot wait for this.
To fight this monolithic, Kafkaesque system, they do not turn to a traditional conservative philosopher.
They don't.
No. They don't quote a free market economist like Milton Friedman or a classical liberal thinker. Ironically, they reach all the way across the political aisle and grab a playbook traditionally used by their absolute ideological opposites.
Who do they turn to?
They turn to the patron saint of radical left-wing organizing, Saul Alinsky.
Listener, if you are not familiar with the name Saul Alinsky, he is a towering figure in American political history.
A massive figure.
He was a community organizer from Chicago who, in 1971, wrote a highly controversial, immensely influential book called Rules for Radicals.
Yes.
Historically, Alinsky is viewed as a left-wing agitator. He dedicated his entire life to empowering marginalized, impoverished groups to fight back against landlords, corporations, and corrupt city governments.
Right. He was all about the underdog.
He is often cited as a major influence on prominent Democratic figures in the U.S., so the idea that a right-leaning, culturally conservative European broadcast is obsessed with this book is just total intellectual whiplash.
The hosts of the broadcast actually acknowledge this irony on air.
They do.
Yes, they admit their own historical bias, stating they always view Alinsky as the political enemy, a radical who wanted to tear down their beloved institutions.
Sure.
But they explain that once they actually sat down and read the book, they had a revelation. They realized that Rules for Radicals is not a partisan Marxist manifesto.
What is it, then?
It is entirely devoid of high-minded morality. It is a purely pragmatic, deeply cynical, and ruthlessly effective manual for seizing and wielding power.
Wow.
And the broadcasters realized that power doesn't care about ideology. Power only cares about leverage.
And to find that leverage, the program analyzes how Alinsky divides society. Because Alinsky didn't use complex economic jargon, right? He divided the world into 3 blunt categories.
Right, very simple categories.
First, you have the haves. These are the elite, the people with the wealth, the institutional power, and the social control. Their only goal is to maintain the status quo, because obviously the status quo benefits them.
Makes sense.
Second, you have the have-nots. These are the desperate, the marginalized, the people freezing in the streets. They want to burn the system down because they have absolutely nothing to lose.
Right, they are the bottom.
And then, caught between them, is the vast majority of society. The group Alinsky termed the have-a-little-want-mores.
They have a little want mores.
This is the middle class. And this is where the Dutch commentators make a critical, brilliant adaptation of Alinsky's framework for their own audience.
How do they adapt it?
The broadcasters argue that the modern Dutch and broadly Western middle class is no longer a rising class of want-mores. They categorize them as a falling class.
A falling class. Let's unpack the psychology of that, because it is entirely different from being a have-not.
It is completely different.
The broadcast argues that this middle class remembers what it felt like to have security. They remember having significant wealth, they remember a sense of civic freedom, and they remember possessing a strong, cohesive national identity.
They have memories of the good old days.
Exactly. But today, due to inflation, energy policies, and rapid cultural shifts, they feel they are rapidly losing all of it. They are slipping down the ladder.
And according to Alinsky's psychology, which the hosts fully adopt, this makes the falling class incredibly difficult to organize politically.
Why is that?
Because they are paralyzed by the fear of losing the little they have left. A true have-not will riot in the streets because they have no property to protect.
Right. No skin in the game.
But the falling middle-class citizen is terrified. They still have their Audi parked in the driveway, even if they can barely afford the gas. They still have their mortgage, even if the interest rates are drowning them. They still have their middle management job. They desperately want political change, but they demand a 100% ironclad guarantee of success before they will stick their necks out because they don't want to risk their depreciating assets.
They are, as Alinsky described, paralyzed by inertia. They are the hardest group to mobilize.
So they just complain but do nothing.
Exactly. So the Dutch broadcast is essentially using this segment to shake their own audience awake. They are trying to figure out how to overcome this middle-class paralysis.
And how do they do that?
Well, to do that, they dive into Alinsky's intense, almost shocking pragmatism. The expert on the program brings up their favorite historical example of an organizer from Alinsky's book.
Okay, who is it?
And again, prepare for whiplash, because it's not a union boss or a politician. It's the Apostle Paul from the New Testament.
The Apostle Paul?
Yes. Alinsky, who was a secular Jewish organizer, viewed the Apostle Paul as one of the greatest community organizers in human history.
That is wild. Why Paul?
Because Paul possessed a singular, monumental goal: spreading the new theology of Christianity across the entire Gentile globe.
Okay.
But the source points out that Paul faced a massive logistical problem. The early Christian movement was tied heavily to Judaism, which came with incredibly strict, culturally isolating rules.
Right, specifically regarding dietary laws like eating kosher and the physical requirement of circumcision.
Right.
Let me jump in here because framing the Apostle Paul as a ruthless political operator feels almost sacrilegious, which makes it such a fascinating rhetorical choice for a conservative broadcast.
It is definitely provocative.
The program points out that Paul looked at the Mediterranean world and realized a cold, hard political fact. If he demanded that every Greek and Roman convert strictly adheres to these painful, isolating purity tests, his movement was going to fail completely.
People were just not going to sign up.
Exactly.
So Paul did what every great organizer must do. He compromised on the methodology to save the mission. He essentially declared, You don't want to follow the strict dietary laws? Fine, eat what you want. You don't want to be circumcised? Fine, we'll waive that requirement. Just accept the overarching theology of the resurrection.
He dropped the barriers to entry.
Yes. He stripped away the purity tests in favor of ruthless effectiveness. He met the people exactly where they were, rather than demanding they instantly ascend to his ideal standard.
The Dutch broadcasters admire this pragmatism deeply. They are using this biblical example to tell their own right-leaning conservative audience, stop fighting with each other.
Stop the infighting.
Stop fracturing your own political movement over every little ideological purity test. Stop demanding that every politician agree with you 100% on every single issue.
Focus on the big picture.
Focus on the grand goal of dismantling the Kafkaesque machine. It is a call for brutal political realism over idealistic martyrdom.
And once they establish that mindset, the broadcasters dive into the specific tactical rules from Alinsky's playbook that they really want their audience to weaponize against the current establishment.
Okay, let's look at how they apply a few of these rules. The first major rule they highlight is, quote, power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have.
This rule is entirely about the manipulation of optics and the weaponization of mystery.
And to illustrate this for a Dutch audience, the program uses the example of Geenstijl.
Right, Geenstijl.
For our listeners outside Europe, Geenstijl is a very famous, highly provocative, often right-wing Dutch blog that launched in the early 2000s.
They were very disruptive.
When Geenstijl first hit the scene, they were ruthless. They terrified the traditional political establishment in The Hague. The politicians and legacy media assumed Geenstijl was this massive, well-funded, highly organized media conglomerate with spies everywhere.
But the broadcasters point out the hilarious reality. In its early days, Geenstijl wasn't a conglomerate at all.
What were they?
It was literally just 4 guys sitting on beanbags in a messy room with laptops, drinking beer, and hitting refresh.
That is amazing.
But they understood Alinsky's rule perfectly.
Yeah.
They maintained the mystery. They never showed the establishment the beanbags.
Right, you don't show the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. They acted significantly bigger, more organized, and more dangerous than they actually were.
Right.
The rule here is, never show your structural weakness.
If the bureaucracy senses you are small or disorganized, they will crush you without a second thought.
Right. But if you project an aura of unpredictable power, they will hesitate. And in that hesitation, you find your leverage.
It's the ultimate evolution of fake it till you make it, but applied to political warfare.
Totally.
Another rule the broadcasters absolutely love and explicitly encourage their listeners to use is, quote, ridicule is man's most potent weapon.
Because ridicule bypasses logic entirely.
How so?
The program explains that if you debate a technocrat using logic, they will drown you in white papers, statistics, and bureaucratic jargon. You literally cannot out-bureaucrat a bureaucrat.
They have too much paperwork.
Exactly. But if you make them the punchline of a joke, if you create a meme that exposes their absurdity, they have no structural defense.
They just get mad.
Right. Anger becomes their only response.
Yeah.
And as Alinsky noted, when those in power get angry, they abandon their carefully crafted optics, they lash out, and they make fatal political mistakes.
Which feeds perfectly into the final Alinsky tactic the broadcast highlights. Quote, make the enemy live up to its own book of rules.
This is a devastating tactic.
This is arguably the most devastating tool in the box. The commentators apply this directly to modern climate policy.
Okay, give us the example.
They point to international politicians and elite technocrats who preach severe climate austerity to the middle class, demanding that average citizens stop flying, stop eating meat, and accept massive taxes on their heating bills.
But those same politicians routinely fly around the world in fleets of private jets to attend luxury climate summits in Davos or Dubai.
Exactly. The Alinsky tactic here is simple. You don't even have to invent a counter-argument about climate science. You just meticulously, relentlessly document their hypocrisy.
You hold up a mirror.
You force them to live by the impossible Kafkaesque standards they legislated for everyone else until the internal contradiction causes their moral authority to just collapse under its own weight.
Okay, so let's pull all this theory down to the ground level. I'm listening to this in my hammock. I understand the fear, the bureaucracy, the guilt, and the tactics.
Right.
But what does the broadcast actually want me to do on Monday morning?
The host in the broadcast actually pushes back on their own expert with this exact question. They say, essentially, our listeners have to stop whining about the scene. The scene is the general, vague, bad state of the world, like saying the economy is bad, or the culture is rotting, or the government is corrupt.
Okay, so broad complaints.
The program argues that complaining about the scene is completely useless because it is too vast. You cannot fight a scene. You have to pivot to what they call thermopolitics.
Thermopolitics. This is where the rubber meets the road.
What does that actually look like?
Thermopolitics means you have to pick a hyper-specific, localized issue. You need a flag to rally around and a slogan that fits on a bumper sticker. You don't protest global elite overreach. You protest this specific zoning law that stops farmers from using this specific fertilizer.
Keep it super narrow and actionable.
Exactly. And when you engage in that localized fight, the broadcasters emphasize Alinsky's rule of negotiation. You must publicly demand 100% of what you want, sounding completely uncompromising, so that behind closed doors, you can negotiate and walk away with 40%.
Because in the pragmatic view of Alinsky, 40% of something is infinitely better than 100% of nothing.
Right. And crucially, regarding Kafka's Bureaucracy, the program insists you must hold individuals accountable, not abstract institutions.
You cannot attack the Ministry of Health. It's a building.
Right. It doesn't feel pain or embarrassment. You have to isolate the specific mid-level director who wrote the policy, plaster their name everywhere, and put all the social and political pressure directly on them.
You give the faceless bureaucracy a human face, and then you attack that face.
It is a highly aggressive, deeply confrontational, and utterly pragmatic approach. The Dutch broadcasters are trying to teach their middle-class audience how to dismantle the power structures they feel are crushing them, using the very tools forged by the radical left.
Wow. Okay. We have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of intellectual ground today.
We really have.
Let's take a breath and do a quick recap of the incredible philosophical whiplash we just experienced alongside the hosts of Ongehoord Nederland.
The broadcast took us on a massive psychological journey. They started in the 19th century with Søren Kierkegaard diagnosing our modern paralysis and urging us to find the terrifying courage of the knight of faith.
To embrace the strawberries and milk, as Bergman's knight did, even when the macro world feels like a plague-ridden wasteland.
Right. Then they violently pulled us out of that personal joy and plunged us into the suffocating, inescapable labyrinth of Franz Kafka's The Trial.
They used Kafka to map out the tyranny without a tyrant, applying that bureaucratic dread not just to government regulations like Amsterdam's garbage, but directly to the exhausting, unwinnable guilt traps of modern identity politics and the Frankfurt School.
And finally, they took all of that existential dread, all of that Kafkaesque frustration, and they weaponized it. They adopted the ruthless, pragmatic tactics of Saul Alinsky, a radical leftist organizer, to try and build a highly realistic, aggressive resistance movement for a conservative, middle-class audience that is terrified of losing its standing.
It is undeniably a masterclass in using diverse, completely opposing historical texts to build a singular, highly effective, modern political worldview.
It truly is a rhetorical marvel. Again, whether you agree with their underlying politics or find them deeply problematic, the architecture of their argument, the way they stack Kierkegaard on top of Kafka, on top of Alinsky, is absolutely fascinating to dissect.
But before we sign off and leave you to the rest of your perfect summer afternoon in the hammock, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Yes, something to mull over.
This is something that wasn't explicitly stated in the source material, but it is the lingering question that arises when you connect all these philosophical dots.
Think about this structural paradox. If we fully internalize Alinsky's rules, if we decide to treat every single social interaction, every cultural debate, and every localized government policy strictly as a ruthless, zero-sum battle for power and leverage, wait, do we inherently risk becoming the very Kafkaesque machine we are trying to destroy?
That is the ultimate trap, isn't it? If everything in your life becomes a calculated power struggle, if every action is viewed only through the cynical lens of political gain and thermopolitics, do you permanently lose the ability to just sit quietly on the beach?
You might.
Do you become so obsessed with the crusade that you forget how to simply taste the strawberries in the milk? When you turn your entire life into a war, you might permanently forget how to live in peace.
That is a really sobering thought.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into our source material. We hope this exploration gave you a new lens and a new vocabulary to view the complex cultural and political debates happening all around you. Keep analyzing the rhetoric, keep questioning the architecture of the information you consume, and always remember to look for the brushstrokes. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.